Happiness is 1984 in our rear-view mirror. It's the final few releases for 1984 on NES Works Gaiden, episode 22. We've seen a surprising number of mouse-based action games on SG-1000, which is to say 2, and now we come to the source and origin of all such things with Namco's Mappy, or rather Namcot, their home publishing label in the early Famicom days. A minor arcade hit for the company, Mappy really does seem like the origin point of a lot of action game trends of the era. Not just the prevalence of mice as protagonists, but also the tendency for post-Pac-Man arcade games to take a sort of throw the kitchen sink at the wall approach to game design, with mixed results. With core gameplay designed by Eiji Sato, Mappy debuted in 1983 and appears to have gone over reasonably well in its home territory, given how actively Namco has given its sequels and revivals, though it's a mere cult favorite outside Japan, at best. The package has a definite appeal, starring a plucky cartoon mouse who simultaneously pursues and evades a gang of criminal kitties out to launch a daring museum heist. The chase evasion element seems Namco's creative minds arcing back to their big hit Pac-Man, as Mappy himself has to avoid direct contact with the creatures that roam the passages of the museum, and relies on strategically placed items in the environment to allow him to briefly turn the table on his foes. In this case, the items in questions are not energizers that give Mappy a temporary power-up, but rather doors that he can slam open into a mouse's face to stun them. Doors can only be opened in one direction, denoted by a small mark poking out of the ceiling above them. A simple wooden door will only stun a cat if it hits that cat in the face. Blue doors, on the other hand, somehow send a ripple of energy across the screen when opened, and any kitten caught in its blast will be bowled over and swept momentarily off the screen. That's true even of the kitten's burly boss, a crime boss cat, known in the US version as Goro. Maybe that's why Mappy never took off in the US, like it did in Japan. What kind of a name is Goro for a cat? On the other hand, in Japan, Goro is Nyamko, a portmanteau of the company's name, Namco, and nya, the Japanese onomatopoeia for cat sounds, equivalent to meow. That's clever. Goro, on the other hand, is the name of some weird claymation dude. Anyway, Mappy has to run through the museum while avoiding contact with Nyamko and his Miyuki gang, collecting artwork and treasures. One would like to assume Mappy aims to keep those valuables safe from the looters, but bear in mind he is a cop, and you know what they say about all cops. Speaking of bastards, you get a sense of how broadly Eiji Sato looked for gameplay inspirations to non-Namco works if you take too long to complete a stage. In order to hustle players to the end of a stage or die and encourage the next coin drop, a bizarre and invincible token bearing Nyamko's face, which is evidently called the Gozenso coin, appears and begins chasing Mappy around, just like the greatest retro gaming bastard of all, Evil Otto from Stern's Berserk. In fact, the vibe of the cat and mouse collectathon chase that runs throughout Mappy is the only aspect of the game that truly channels Pac-Man. For the most part, Mappy really reaches further back into video game history, to the platformer, Universal's Space Panic. Rather than playing out in a top-down maze a la the many Pac-Man derivatives of the early 80s, and rather than filling the screen with things that must be changed or claimed for territory control, Mappy instead takes the form of a side-scrolling platform action game. As with basically every other Namco arcade title of this era, Mappy originally played on a vertically oriented monitor. For a platform game, this arrangement translates into an extra tall space that scrolls laterally, giving Mappy fairly short lines of sight to keep an eye on the criminal kitties. It also means the game had to be visibly compromised to run on Famicom. In arcades, Mappy's action takes place across a 6-level building. On Famicom, that's truncated down to 5. This compression makes the game more challenging, similar to Xevious' truncated crosshair range. You have fewer options for evading the Miyukis, though the trade-off is greater lateral visibility than in the original, which gives you a small edge in tracking your enemy's movements. That said, most of the vertical compression happens in the dead space at the top and bottom of the screen. The space beneath the floor is no longer rendered here, and the roof or attic where Goro and his gang spawn has been shortened. The cut of a single floor isn't ideal, but some other home versions of Mappy sliced off 2 floors, so it certainly could have been worse. So if this is a platform game, what makes it more of a Space Panic throwback than, say, Donkey Kong Jr.? Simply put, Mappy, like white men, can't jump. Rather than leaping between levels of the museum, He instead gets about by dropping down into open spaces in the floor and bouncing back up via trampoline. Yes, this is the world's only art museum to feature open gaps in its upper floors and trampolines built into the ground level. When Mappy drops down and bounds back upward, the player can choose which floor he'll land on by pressing right or left on the joystick at the appropriate time. It's a little goofy, but trampoline hopping has strategic value, as Namco and the Mukies can't hurt Mappy if they happen to pass one another while bounding in the gaps. Only the deadly murder coin has that power. With multiple cats chasing Mappy across a multi-story building filled with doors and trampolines, the action maintains a fairly hectic pace throughout. At the same time, the action is less intuitive or immediate than Namco's true greats like Pac-Man and Galaga, though it certainly feels less hostile and bewildering than something like Tower of Duraga. I suppose in that sense you could see Mappy as something of a transitional title, as Namco began to explore the post-Pac world and the growing demands of savvy arcade-goers for greater complexity and unexpected novelty. It certainly has found its fan base, Japanese kids and Western furries for the most part, but it's never had the big breakthrough success of Namco's greatest games. Even so, it did inspire its share of sequels. There was its direct follow-up, Hopping Mappy, which is the baffling Dig Dug 2 to the original Mappy's Dig Dug, and is probably best forgotten. On the console side, Namco recruited Tosei to create Mappy Land, the only game in the franchise to reach the American NES, which will eventually appear in NES Works 1989. While Arc System Works put together Mappy Kids, which is basically just a standard 8-bit platformer with little hint of the arcade game's quirks. Mappy has also been the basis of a handful of forgotten mobile ports and spin-offs, as well as the wellspring of inspiration for Chris Straub's sadly vanished Shifty Look comic. But really, Mappy's true legacy might be the sheer number of games it inspired. Sega has cited it as a direct influence on Flicky, and Jaleco's City Connection basically mashes up Mappy and Flicky, then adds back the Pac-Man territory control concept to the mix. And then of course you have games like Tasmania Story for Game Boy, which was derived from a Mappy clone called Fruit Panic. So Mappy's everywhere, just as you'd expect from a mouse. But please use a humane trap. Thank you. That wraps it up for Japan-only 1984 Famicom releases, as well as third-party Famicom releases for the year. From this point on, it's only Nintendo first-party games that also shipped in the US as launch titles for the NES, beginning with this one, Urban Champion. My apologies. Urban Champion lingers in memory as one of the more notable duds of the NES launch lineup. It wasn't quite as bad as Stack Up, given that it's actually a finished game, but it certainly wasn't much fun to play when you had Kung Fu or Super Mario Bros. So does it fare any better here, in its original context as a 1984 release? I suppose to be fair, I have to say yes. The closest any home console has come to offering an equivalent release to Urban Champion to this point has been Sega's wrestling and boxing games, which also sport the word champion in the title, almost suggesting this is some wayward SG-1000 release. Urban Champion lacks the visual punch, if you'll forgive the term, of Champion Boxing. Its characters appear here as much smaller digital people than those of Sega's game, but in terms of playability it fares better. There's a more concrete Champion Boxing connection here. Nintendo reportedly based the design of Urban Champion around the concept of the Game & Watch boxing handheld, which had shipped earlier in 1984. It's not much of a stretch to envision it, though the NES game does add a few new elements. Urban Champion contains the essence, if not the substance or quality, of a fighting game. Compared to other proto-fighters of the day, such as Konami's JR Kung Fu, it demonstrates less variety and complexity in exchange for the streamlined simplicity we usually associate with Nintendo. Two brawlers face off against one another in a side-scrolling perspective, closing the gap and asserting dominance with fists. This is a literal Street Fighter, with matches taking place in front of store facades and apartment buildings. And players win a match by slugging the other brawler to the point that they stagger backward into the conveniently placed manholes. Urban Champion takes a playful approach to its settings, with fights occasionally disengaging to feign peace as the police drive past, and annoyed neighbors attempting to drop flower pots on the thugs duking it out beneath their windows. Is it an amazing game? Hardly. But it has its charms, and you can almost imagine its charismatic visuals going a long way toward compensating for its cute but primitive action. Still doesn't explain Nintendo's obsession with bringing it back at every opportunity, though. Fortunately, beyond Urban Champion, we have a couple of games that match their charm to greater playability. Clu Clu Land is Nintendo's second attempt at the maze chase genre, and like Devil World, it has a few little quirks and oddities that keep it from being quite the same level of pick-up-and-play instant classic as Pac-Man. In this case, the primary quirks amount to two. First, you don't navigate the maze in the traditional fashion. Protagonist Bubbles takes the Newtonian motion of Pac-Man, namely that an object in motion tends to stay in motion, to its greatest possible extreme. Where Pac-Man constantly flaps his jaws forward along his current path when not under the player's control, but can be made to stop by butting up against a wall, Bubbles has no such respite. What few walls you'll find in her maze appear to be made of rubber, and there is no glue. So once she hits a wall or powers into a corner, she simply bounces away in the opposite direction. And in keeping with this strange, frictionless hell in which Bubbles finds herself trapped, you also can't directly control Bubbles' movements through the maze. Simply pressing in a direction perpendicular to Bubbles' current motion does not cause her to bank 90 degrees and start off down that path. Instead, you press left or right to reach out with Bubbles' corresponding hand, which allows her to grasp one of the poles that appear throughout the maze. This is a case where the artful Japanese box helps provide clarity for the concept of the game otherwise lacking in the more literal American packaging. What appear to be dots throughout the maze when viewed from above are in fact small poles that Bubbles can use as a sort of pivot. Snag a pole, and Bubbles will begin to rotate around it. Release a pole and she'll go sailing away along the next 90-degree axis to line up with her pivoting orientation. This is a little vague at first, but with time it begins to make sense and even becomes second nature. It's a more deliberate form of maze navigation than Pac-Man's simple direct controls, because it means you can't simply double back in the direction you came from. Instead, you're forced to rotate 180 degrees into the next channel and double back along a parallel corridor. Fortunately, Bubbles will hang onto a pole for as long as you press the controller, which means you can spin around a fulcrum for as long as you need to consider your next move, provided one of the sea urchins doesn't get you while you dawdle. The other unique feature that sets Clu Clu Land apart is its territory control element. Rather than emptying a maze here, you're instead filling it. As you pass over spaces, you may uncover a gemstone hidden beneath. Not every space in the maze contains a gem to reveal, and each maze contains a different pattern of jewels. Your objective is to reveal the entire pattern within the maze and light it up with glittering gems rather than snagging the jewels and turning the maze into a lifeless void. This has a pretty big impact on how each stage plays, because you don't need to pass over every square of territory. Once you determine the pattern, you can focus strictly on passing over the gems. It's a pretty neat idea, and while Clu Clu Land isn't a true timeless cornerstone of the maze genre, it honestly is a lot more entertaining than it's often given credit for. A pretty enjoyable release to help round out the year, and one that fares better when it doesn't have a bunch of other black box games to deal with on the same launch day. And finally, a strong finale for the year with Shigeru Miyamoto's very first racing game. Excitebike is a very different kind of racing game than we've seen on Famicom or SG-1000, with an emphasis on performing wicked tricks rather than outperforming other drivers. Unusually, Excitebike takes the form of a side-scrolling action game that also happens to involve racing. That point of view had rarely been used for this genre, and honestly it remains a novelty even now. For the most part, racing games tended to originate in arcades and could luxuriate in the options afforded by dedicated cabinets and hardware. Up until the point that Sega's Turbo and Namco's pole position popularized behind-the-car perspectives, you typically saw racers adopt a top-down viewpoint on vertical screens that allowed maximum forward viewing space. Something that tended to involve a lot of compromise when brought to home hardware, as seen with Monaco GP. Although a few developers attempted to combine the top-down viewpoint with home television-friendly horizontal scrolling, as with Grand Prix for Atari 2600, that approach always felt awkward. Excitebike neatly solves all this awkwardness by rotating the camera angle down about 45 degrees so that you see the racer from a side-on perspective while still accommodating lateral motion as you race along the track. The side-scrolling racer wasn't entirely unheard of, as the world's very first third-party game, Activision's Dragster, was an extraordinarily primitive attempt to create precisely that. But Excitebike offers much more nuance, not to mention more to do, than Dragster could ever have dreamed. The big innovation that this viewpoint brings to the genre is elevation. Again, the concept of catching air in a racing game wasn't entirely new here. Data East's Bump and Jump, a top-down vertical racer, was built around that entire concept. With Excitebike, though, the process of taking to the air feels far more intuitive. The track contains bumps, ramps, and raised platforms that will send your bike soaring into the air without the need for a jump button. The challenge then becomes to control the pitch of your airborne motorcycle to land safely, without taking a tumble, and maintain your momentum so that you can complete the current track within the given time limit. Other racers show up on the track, but this is strictly a time trial rather than a contest for the pole position, so those competing racers amount to obstacles or hazards to be avoided. The only precedent I've been able to find for a game in this style came from SNK, also in 1984. A Famicom system arcade release called Jumping Cross. An admirable, ambitious effort, Jumping Cross attempted to combine both top-down vertical motorcycle racing with the side view format featuring elevated track obstacles quite similar to Excitebikes. The internet gives only a vague 1984 release date for Jumping Cross, which means it's possible it showed up in arcades early in the year and helped inspire SNK's Kansai-based neighbors at Nintendo to make a better version of that game. Or it could have shipped later in the year and be a case of two developers arriving at a similar idea at the same time. In any case, Excitebike genuinely holds up to the test of time. It's a charming little racer with a largely unique premise, executed with sufficient panache and confidence to play well even by 21st century standards. The sight of little cartoon racing people scrambling on their stubby legs to get back to their bikes after a spill remains hilarious more than 35 years later, and the finesse required to balance a bike after launching it into the air while managing engine heat on the ground requires a deft touch without being an onerous burden. All in all, a strong send-off for a year that saw the Famicom surging ahead of the competition. Excitebike is a promising sign of what the year ahead will bring for the fledgling console, although there will be plenty of games more along the lines of Urban Champion as third parties enter the fray. As we'll see this fall, once NES Works Gaiden finishes up the Famicom 1985 lineup in anticipation leading up to the American NES launch.